The hospital bed smelled like antiseptic and someone else's decisions. I couldn't move my left arm. The ceiling tiles had water stains shaped like countries I'd never visit. A nurse adjusted something near my fore, and I asked her where my family was. She smiled in that careful way people do when they don't want to answer. I looked at my phone. 14 hours had passed since the accident. There were 3 missed calls, all from my insurance company. That's when I realized something was very wrong. Let me go back to the beginning. Not the dramatic beginning. The quiet one. I'm not someone who talks about money. I was raised not to. My father built a small construction business over 30 years, sold it when his knees gave out, and left everything to me when he passed. Not because I was his favorite. Because I was the one who showed up. Every hospital visit. Every pharmacy run. Every phone call he made at 2 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. My brother and sister had lives. That's what they called it. Lives. Jobs in other cities, partners, reasons they couldn't come. I never argued with that. I just stayed. When my father died, he left me the house, the savings, and a modest investment account. The total was somewhere around $2.3 million. I didn't tell anyone the exact number. But people talk. Especially family. For a while, everything was fine. I lived alone. I worked remotely, project management for a logistics firm. I kept the house in good condition. I wasn't flashy about the inheritance. I drove the same car I'd had for 6 years. I paid my bills early. I was quiet. Then came the accident. It was a Tuesday in November. A delivery truck ran a red light on a road I'd driven 100 times. My car was totaled. I had a fractured collarbone, a broken wrist, 2 cracked ribs, and a concussion. I was in the hospital for 4 days and then transferred to a short-term rehabilitation facility for 2 weeks. In those 18 days, my brother called once. My sister texted 3 times. The texts were short. Hope you feel better. Let us know if you need anything. Thinking of you. No one came. I told myself there were explanations. Distance. Work. The expense of last-minute travel. I gave them the benefit of every doubt I had. When I finally got home, I couldn't drive. I could barely cook. My right hand was dominant, and my right wrist was the one that had been broken. I ordered groceries online. I watched a lot of television. I healed slowly. About 3 weeks after I came home, my sister called. A real call, not a text. She said she felt terrible about not visiting. She said she wanted to come see me, spend some time, help me get back on my feet. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She arrived with her husband and stayed for a week. It felt good, at first. She cooked dinner. She cleaned up the kitchen. She sat with me in the evenings. But she also asked questions. Small ones. Careful ones. Where did I keep important documents? Had I updated my will since Dad passed? Was the house fully paid off? What was I planning to do with everything if something happened to me? I answered vaguely. I said I had things in order. She nodded and moved on. Then my brother came. 2 weeks after my sister left. He'd never visited the house before. Not once in the 3 years I'd lived there. He said he just wanted to check in. He brought a bottle of wine and seemed genuinely warm. He also had questions. He asked if I'd considered a trust. He mentioned he'd spoken to a financial advisor, someone who worked with families in situations like mine. He offered to connect me. He said it casually, over pasta, like it was a favor. I thanked him. I said I'd think about it. That night, I sat in the kitchen after he went to bed. Something I couldn't name was sitting in my chest. Not anger. Not fear. Something quieter than both. I started thinking about timing. My sister visited 6 weeks after my accident. My brother 3 weeks after her. Neither of them had visited in over a year before that. Neither called while I was in the hospital. Neither offered to help with medical bills or physical therapy. But both of them, within weeks of each other, showed up with questions about my estate. I thought about my father. I thought about how he used to say that the true test of a person isn't how they treat you when you're fine. It's what they reach for when they think you're vulnerable. I started to notice other things. My sister had borrowed my laptop one afternoon to check her email. She'd been on it for 40 minutes. My brother had asked, twice, if I had a filing cabinet and where I kept it. He'd walked through every room of the house at some point during his stay, always with a small excuse, getting water, looking for the bathroom, checking if I needed anything. I didn't say anything. I watched. I watched the way my sister photographed the house on her phone and said she was sending pictures to a friend who loved old architecture. I watched the way my brother lingered in my father's old office, running his hand along the bookshelf like he was looking for something specific. I said nothing. I stayed calm. I brought coffee and asked how their families were. Because I understood something. If I reacted now, whatever they were planning would just go underground. I would see nothing. Know nothing. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. The email wasn't meant for me. That's the thing about people who think they're being careful, they get comfortable. And comfortable people make mistakes. My brother had used the shared family laptop I kept in the living room. Not my main work machine. The old one I'd set up for guests, connected to the house Wi-Fi, auto-signed into a browser profile I hadn't checked in months. He thought he'd logged out. He hadn't. 3 days after he left, I opened the laptop to look up a physical therapy exercise. The browser was still open. His Gmail was sitting there, quiet and unguarded, like an unlocked drawer. I almost closed it. I didn't. The thread was titled, Dad's House, Next Steps. It was between my brother, my sister, and someone I didn't recognize. A name I'd never heard. I would find out later he was a private estate attorney, not mine. Theirs. I read slowly. I read everything. The thread went back 4 months. 4 months before either of them visited me. It started 2 weeks after my accident, when I was still in the rehabilitation facility, when I still couldn't fully hold a pen. My sister's first message was brief. She wrote that the accident was a window. Her word. Window. She said I was alone, I had no spouse, no children, and that if something happened to me without an updated will, the estate would go through probate and could be contested. She said they needed to move before I got back to normal. My brother replied the same day. He agreed. He said he'd been thinking about it since the funeral, my father's funeral, and that the original will had always been unfair. He wrote that I had been manipulated by our father's illness into receiving a disproportionate share. He used that word. Manipulated. As if sitting with a dying man was a scheme. As if answering phone calls at 2 in the morning was a manipulation. The attorney's responses were measured. Professional. He laid out options. A legal challenge to the existing will on grounds of undue influence. A petition to have me declared partially incapacitated following the accident, which could trigger a guardianship review. And a third option, the one they seemed most interested in, getting me to voluntarily update my own documents while I was isolated, still injured, still dependent. That was the purpose of the visits. My sister was supposed to build trust. Warmth. She would establish a reason to be present in my life again. My brother would come second, introduce the idea of financial planning, and connect me to their attorney, the one they were calling a neutral party. Their goal was to get me into a room with that attorney, confused and grateful and healing, and walk out with documents that transferred significant control of my estate to a joint family trust, managed, primarily, by my brother. I read the entire thread twice. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling. I wasn't shaking. That surprised me. I thought I would be. I felt something closer to clarity. The kind that comes when something you half suspected turns out to be completely true. The fog lifts and there's just the hard ground underneath. I took photographs of every email in that thread. 17 messages total. I photographed the screen from multiple angles, making sure the sender names, timestamps, and content were all visible. Then I forwarded the entire thread to my personal email account from his logged-in session, carefully, without marking anything as read, without changing anything. Then I closed the laptop and put it back exactly where it had been. I made dinner. I watched something on television. I went to bed at my normal time. Over the next few days, I moved carefully. I didn't call my brother or sister. I responded to their check-in texts the same way I always had. Short, pleasant, unbothered. Doing well. Physical therapy going good. Thanks for checking in. I needed them calm. I needed them to believe the plan was still on track. In the meantime, I started building a record. I wrote down every conversation I could remember from both visits, dates, approximate times, exact wording where I could recall it. The questions about documents. The offer to connect me with a financial advisor. The comment about the trust. I wrote it all down in a plain document and saved it in 3 places. I pulled my phone records and took note of the dates my brother and sister had called me, or hadn't. Nothing in the 37 days before my accident. Nothing during my 4 days in the hospital. 1 call from my sister on day 9 of rehab. That was it. Then I contacted my own attorney. Not to act yet. Just to understand. She was a woman I'd worked with when I handled my father's estate. Precise, unhurried, someone who listened more than she spoke. I told her I needed a confidential consultation. I told her I had documentation of an attempt to manipulate my estate planning while I was recovering from an injury. She told me to bring everything. I also did one more thing before that meeting. I called my brother. Friendly call. Normal tone. I told him I'd been thinking about what he said, about the financial advisor, the trust, the planning. I said I thought he was right. I said I was ready to have that conversation. He sounded relieved in a way that told me everything. He said he'd set something up. He said he just wanted what was best for the family. I said I knew that. I hung up and sat quietly for a moment. There are things you can unknow and things you can't. The way someone sounds when they think they've won, that stays with you. It doesn't make you angry. It makes you precise. I saved the call recording. My phone logs automatically in my state. Entirely legal. I added it to the file. Confronting them would have ruined everything. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes before something permanent. Not silence. Quiet. The difference is intention. I moved through the next 3 weeks in that quiet. Deliberate. Unhurried. Every morning I woke up, made coffee, and did exactly what someone who suspected nothing would do. I answered texts. I asked about my nephew's soccer game. I sent my sister a photo of the backyard after it snowed. Underneath all of it, I was building something they couldn't see. My attorney's name was Margaret. I'd known her professionally for 4 years, but I'd never needed her the way I needed her now. When I walked into her office with a printed folder, emails, call logs, written notes, the recorded phone call, she read everything without a word. When she finished, she set the folder down and looked at me. She said, "They were serious about this." I said, "I know." She said, "So are we." That was the entire conversation. That's the kind of attorney you want. Margaret explained the situation clearly. What my brother and sister had discussed in those emails constituted an attempt to exert undue influence over an estate. The guardianship angle, the idea of petitioning to have me declared partially incapacitated, was particularly significant. That was not just unethical. Depending on how far they took it, it could cross into legal territory that carried real consequences. She told me we had 2 priorities. First, make my current estate documents airtight and unassailable. Update everything, properly witnessed, properly notarized, with a clear paper trail showing I was of sound mind, acting independently, without pressure from anyone. Second, document everything they did from this point forward. Every contact. Every suggestion. Every introduction to their attorney. Let them build their case. Then dismantle it completely. I followed her instructions exactly. Within 10 days, I had a new will, a properly structured trust of my own, and updated beneficiary designations across every account. Margaret brought in a colleague to serve as an independent witness, someone with no connection to me or my family, specifically to establish that the process was clean. I also met with my financial institution and placed a private notation on my accounts. Nothing visible to outsiders. Just a flag that required additional verification before any significant changes could be processed. A quiet lock on a door they didn't know existed. Then I set up the backup system. Every piece of documentation lived in 4 places. A fireproof home safe. A safety deposit box at my bank. A secure encrypted cloud folder that only Margaret could access as a secondary key holder. And a physical copy at Margaret's office, sealed and logged. If anything happened to me, anything at all, the entire record would surface automatically. I want to be precise about something. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't building this out of fear. I was building it because my brother and sister had spent 4 months constructing something designed to take advantage of a version of me that no longer existed, an injured, isolated, grieving person who might sign something without reading it carefully. I had read it carefully. I had read everything. 2 weeks after my meeting with Margaret, my brother called with a name. The financial advisor. The neutral party. He said the man's name was Gerald. He said Gerald had worked with several families navigating estate transitions and that he came highly recommended. He said he'd already spoken to Gerald about my situation. Generally, he said, just generally, and that Gerald was available to meet whenever I was ready. I said that sounded great. I asked for Gerald's full name and the name of his firm. My brother gave them to me without hesitation. I passed the information to Margaret that same afternoon. She ran a standard background check and made a quiet inquiry through her professional network. Gerald was real. His firm was real. And his client list included my brother, not as a referral source. As a paying client. Gerald had been working with my brother for at least 8 months. He was not a neutral party. He had never been a neutral party. Margaret documented everything. I also did something I hadn't planned. A few days after the call with my brother, I reached out to someone outside the family. An old colleague of my father's, a man named Bernard who had known our family for decades. He had been at my father's funeral. He had watched my brother and sister arrive late and leave early. He remembered things. I asked Bernard if he'd be willing to write a factual account of what he'd witnessed over the years, my father's illness, who visited, who called, who was present. Not an opinion. Just a factual record. Bernard agreed immediately. He said he'd been waiting for someone to ask. His written account ran to 3 pages. It was specific. It had dates. It had names. It documented the reality of who had been present in my father's final 2 years and who had not. I added it to the file. The file was no longer just a collection of emails and call logs. It was a complete picture. A timeline. A clear, documented sequence of events that began the day of my accident and ended with my brother scheduling a meeting between me and an attorney who worked for him. Meanwhile, my sister called to say she was planning another visit. She said she missed me. She said the holidays were coming and she didn't want me to be alone. She asked if she could bring her husband again. I said yes. Come whenever. The house is always open. She booked flights for 2 weeks out. My brother scheduled the meeting with Gerald for the week after that. They had a sequence. I could see it clearly now. My sister would come first, reinforce the warmth, remind me that family was family. Then the meeting with Gerald. Then, presumably, documents. A trust agreement. A quiet signature from someone who was supposed to be too grateful and too tired to read the fine print. It was a careful plan. It had one problem. I had been 3 steps ahead of it for over a month. I called Margaret and told her the timeline. She made 2 calls. One to an investigator her firm worked with regularly. One to a contact at the state's Elder and Dependent Adult Financial Abuse Unit, because even though I wasn't elderly, the statute covered any adult targeted for financial exploitation during a period of physical vulnerability. The investigator began a quiet background review of Gerald's firm and its recent activities. The Financial Abuse Unit opened a preliminary inquiry. Nothing visible. Nothing that would alert anyone. My sister arrived on a Thursday. She brought flowers. She hugged me for a long time. I made dinner. We talked about her kids. She said I looked good. She said I seemed more like myself. I smiled and said I felt better every day. The meeting with Gerald was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Margaret would be joining me, unannounced. The investigator would have his report ready by Monday evening. The Financial Abuse Unit had a liaison prepared to receive documentation the moment I authorized the transfer. Everyone was in position. My brother texted Sunday night. He said he was looking forward to Tuesday. He said it would be good for all of us to finally sit down together and get things sorted out properly. I texted back, "Me too. See you then." I put my phone down and looked around the house my father built his life to give me. The same ceiling. The same walls. Everything exactly where it should be. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. Tuesday morning came in grey and cold. The kind of morning that doesn't announce itself. No dramatic sunrise. No sharp wind. Just a flat, quiet sky that asked nothing of anyone. I woke up early. Made coffee. Sat at the kitchen table for a long time without my phone, without the television, without anything. Just the sound of the house settling and the occasional car passing outside. I wasn't nervous. I want to be clear about that. Nervous implies uncertainty. I had no uncertainty left. Everything that was going to happen had already been decided, not in that room, not that morning, but over weeks of careful, undramatic work done in private by people who understood exactly what was at stake. I showered. I dressed in something plain and presentable. I ate breakfast. At 9:15, Margaret texted, "Ready when you are." I replied, "See you there." The meeting was scheduled at Gerald's office. A professional suite in a mid-rise building downtown. Glass doors, a receptionist, framed certifications on the wall. The kind of place designed to feel authoritative without feeling hostile. My brother was already in the lobby when I arrived. He looked relaxed. He was wearing a jacket he only wore when he wanted to seem serious. He hugged me and said I looked well. My sister was there too. She smiled the way she always smiled, warm, practiced, the expression of someone who had decided in advance how this day would feel. Gerald came out to greet us. Mid-50s. Firm handshake. The careful ease of someone who did this often. We were walking toward the conference room when the elevator behind us opened. Margaret stepped out. She was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone who had every reason to be exactly where she was. She introduced herself to Gerald by her full name and her firm's name. She said she was my legal counsel and would be joining the meeting. The shift in Gerald's face was small. A fraction. But I had been watching people's faces for months. I saw it. My brother turned to look at me. I met his eyes and said nothing. We went into the conference room and sat down. Margaret set her portfolio on the table and opened it without hurry. She explained, in a voice that was entirely pleasant and entirely immovable, that before any discussion of financial planning or estate matters could proceed, she needed to establish a few points of record. She noted that Gerald had a pre-existing client relationship with my brother spanning at least 8 months. She placed a printed document on the table, the background report, and slid a copy toward Gerald and a copy toward the center of the table. She noted that correspondence existed between my brother, my sister, and Gerald's firm, or an associate of his firm, discussing my estate while I was in a rehabilitation facility following an accident. She placed printed copies of the emails on the table. She noted that a recorded phone call existed in which my brother described connecting me with a financial advisor he characterized as neutral, without disclosing his existing relationship with that advisor. She did not play the recording. She simply noted it existed and that it had been submitted as part of a preliminary inquiry to the state's Financial Abuse Unit. She placed that document on the table too. Then she folded her hands and waited. The room was very quiet. Gerald looked at the documents. He looked at my brother. He said nothing. My sister's face had gone still in a way I hadn't seen before. Not the practiced warmth. Something underneath it. Something that looked like the moment a person realizes the ground has already shifted and they were the last to know. My brother said my name. He said it like a question. I looked at him. I said, "I'm not angry." He started to say something about misunderstandings. About intentions. About how everything had come from a place of concern. Margaret said, quietly, that he was welcome to make those points to the investigator assigned to the preliminary inquiry, and that she would be happy to provide contact information. He stopped talking. What happened after that was not dramatic. That's the part people don't expect when they imagine a moment like this. There was no shouting. No crying. No confrontation that released years of pressure in a single explosive scene. There was paperwork. There were phone calls made in hallways. There was Gerald excusing himself and not returning to the room. There was my brother sitting with his jacket still on, looking at the table, and my sister with her hands folded in her lap staring at a point somewhere past the window. Margaret handled everything with the precision of someone who had done this before and would do it again, and found no pleasure in it beyond the simple satisfaction of things proceeding correctly. The preliminary inquiry became a formal investigation within the week. Gerald's firm was audited for related conduct. His license was placed under review. 2 other families came forward during that audit with similar accounts. That was not something I had anticipated. But it was something the investigator had. My brother and sister were not criminally charged. The investigation concluded that while their conduct was predatory and ethically indefensible, it had not yet crossed into criminal action because no documents had been signed and no funds had been moved. They had planned it. They had prepared it. But I had moved first. What they did face was civil exposure. Margaret sent formal letters documenting the attempt. The letters were not demands. They were records. They stated plainly what had been done, what evidence existed, and what would be filed publicly if any future attempt was made to contest my estate, challenge my capacity, or contact my financial institutions directly. It was, as Margaret described it, a comprehensive deterrent. My brother called once after everything concluded. I let it go to voicemail. He said he was sorry. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he hoped I knew that he loved me. I listened to the message once. I didn't delete it. I saved it to the file. Not out of bitterness. Out of habit. Because the file was how I had stayed safe, and old habits built on good judgment don't need to be abandoned just because the immediate danger has passed. I thought about my father a lot in the weeks that followed. I thought about the nights I sat with him in the hospital when he couldn't sleep. The way he would just talk, about the business, about growing up, about things he wished he'd done differently. He never asked me to be there. I just was. I thought about my father a lot in the weeks that followed. I thought about the nights I sat with him in the hospital when he couldn't sleep. The way he would just talk, about the business, about growing up, about things he wished he'd done differently. He never asked me to be there. I just was. I thought about the night he told me, quietly, that he was leaving the house and everything in it to me. Not because I'd earned it more, but because I had shown him, without ever saying so, that I understood what things were actually for. Not for accumulating. Not for leverage. For living. For being stable enough to take care of yourself and, when the time came, to be present for the people who needed it. He said he trusted me to know the difference between people who wanted to be part of your life and people who wanted to be part of your estate. I hadn't fully understood that when he said it. I understood it now. I changed very little about my daily life after everything concluded. I kept the house. I kept working. I kept the same car. I still ordered groceries online when my wrist ached in the cold, which it still did. I added one thing. A small notebook I kept on the kitchen table. Nothing significant in it. Just observations. Things I noticed. Things worth remembering. Not because I expected another threat, but because the habit of paying attention, of watching before reacting, of understanding before confronting, had kept me whole when almost nothing else had. My father had done the same thing, I realized. He just never called it anything. It was simply how he moved through the world. Quietly. Without urgency. Noticing everything. I had learned it from him without knowing I was learning it. Some mornings I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and looked at the backyard, the same yard he'd maintained for 30 years, the same oak tree he'd planted before I was born, and I felt something I didn't have a precise word for. Not happiness exactly. Not relief. Something quieter than both. Something that had no need to explain itself or perform for anyone. The house was mine. The decisions were mine. The records were filed, secured, and beyond reach. No one was coming. And for the first time since I'd woken up in that hospital bed staring at water-stained ceiling tiles, I wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. That night, everything was quiet.